Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LEC group stage overview and analysis of the Week 1 games. We have hit it. We have gotten through the best of ones in the winter split here in the LEC. It is time for best of threes. We have hit the group stage, and I'm really excited to talk about everything that went down in the group stage, because now we're really starting to see some of the more interesting teams finally start to be tested. Best of threes are a completely different environment than best of ones, and it definitely brings out different versions of a lot of the LEC teams that we have seen so far. I'm excited to go through all 6 best of 3 series that we had in the LEC this week. So if you are excited as well, let me know down in the comment section below. Who were you most looking forward to seeing in a best of 3 matchup going into the week? I'll tell you, for my money, G2 and BDS was a matchup I was very much looking forward to seeing, with how good BDS has been recently and G2's roster being a little bit more feast or famine this year. I was really excited in seeing that matchup, but every single matchup on the docket this week was incredibly interesting and fun to speculate and watch. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Of course, if you are new here, what we're going to be doing is actually something a little bit different than normal, obviously, not only for our LEC videos, but even in comparison to our LCK and LPL videos where they are best of threes. I'm actually going to be going group by group instead of, game by game in the order that they were played. I feel like it's going to be a little bit easier to talk about Group A and then Group B, as opposed to just going in order and kind of jumping back and forth between the two groups. So we'll be going through both of the best of threes in the first round for Group A, and then the winner's bracket, the first place matchup in Group A, and then we'll go through all of Group B, and then, the winner's match in Group B in that order, even though that's not the order it took place. I just feel like it's going to be a little bit more cohesive for the video. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into Group A and our Group A analysis here. And we kicked off Group A with the number 1 seed in the regular season picking their opponent here, and it was Team Vitality taking on Team Heretics. Of course, Vitality finishing first, Heretics finishing 6th, but of course, as we know, grouped into that 5-6, Heretics was put into this group, and Vitality chose to play them over Koi, which I do agree with. I think they are a much weaker opponent on paper than a team like Koi, and luckily for Vitality, that ends up paying off here in this best of 3, as they are able to take the series, although it is very close. Honestly, a very back and forth series for both of these teams. This is the benefit of best of 3, as we get to see a whole new layer and dimension to these teams. If we got a best of 1, Vitality would have looked like the much better team. They would have dominated Heretics in game 1 like they did, and then we never would have gotten these game 2 and 3 games that really opened our eyes, I think, to some of the problems that Vitality might have going into the rest of the year. Game 2, a very strong blowout win for Heretics, really bouncing back and playing well. And then Game 3, very back and forth, but Vitality ends up taking it. What did Vitality do well in this series? Well, honestly, quite a bit. My player of the series, no surprise to anybody who watches this channel, is going to go to Photon in the top lane. I think he's been the best player in the LEC in 2023. He was my pick for, regular split MVP. I don't know how they're going to be doing MVP and All-Pro and stuff like that. So, Photon continues to be fantastic for Vitality, and he continues to push forward. Really, this is for his Gragas game in game number 3, which was spectacular. He is just such a difference maker on that champion. He fits right in to the LEC atmosphere playing Gragas at that level. So many top laners in this region, even junglers in this region, play Gragas at such a high level. Photon fits right into that. His game 3 was spectacular, enabling these carry-oriented picks like the Kindred, like the Azir, like the Sivir. A lot is on the Gragas in this team comp to be able to peel, to be able to separate, hell, even to engage in a lot of times. And so for Vitality, you're really relying on Photon to kind of be the best player on the Rift, and luckily for them, he just was. He was really good in this series. He wasn't the only person who played really well for Vitality, though. I want to give a shout out to Perks. I know that Game 3 was a little bit troll from him, especially towards the back half on the Azir. His mispositioning mistakes, his macro mistakes definitely coming into play. That's something that Perks has never really weeded out of his game ever since coming back from North America. It felt like he just kind of lost that ability to play a lot safer in the back half of games once he went over to Cloud9, and that's been true when he came back to Vitality here and came back to the LEC. But let's not take away how freaking good he was in game number 1. He was easily the player of the game, in my opinion, in game number 1 on the Syndra. He couldn't miss a single ability on the Syndra in game number 1. He looked fantastic, and he just continues to be a huge positive for this team. Bo played ridiculously aggressive as per usual. I would say that he out-jungled Jankos, but both junglers definitely put their teams in some precarious positions, let's just say, especially in their losses. Bo wasn't particularly good in Game 2. Jankos was not particularly good in Game 3, which we will get to. And then Neon and Kaiser were honestly pretty consistent. They have just been essentially the weak side for Vitality all year long. We've talked so much about this top side for Vitality, about Photon, about Bo, about Perks, and about how all three of them have been incredibly strong. All three have been all-pro candidates, but Neon and Kaiser have certainly taken a backseat. Some would call them the weak links of the team, but for the most part, they really just have to step up in the opportunities that they are given. Neon is a late game AD carry. He's a scaling AD carry. He's not someone who wants to play aggressive early. That's what he did on Misfits, is he played pretty passive early. He allowed players like VTO, players like Shatan to be able to generate their leads in their lane, and then Neon could be a very consistent threat over the back half of the game. That's kind of his role in Vitality here. It's just their games don't go all that long, and so he never really gets the opportunity to be online. He gets the Sivir in Game 3, and he does do quite a bit of damage on the one game that does kind of hinge on some team fighting towards the back half. He's fine there, and then Kaiser is Kaiser. I do think he hasn't been nearly as dominant as he's been in past splits so far this year, but that's not a huge problem. He's still a very, very, very good player. So overall, Vitality looking good. Game number 1, complete domination. Perks and Bo looking really strong on the Kindred, Syndra in particular. And then game number 3, the other win, Photon looking phenomenal on the Gragas, really able to step up and do a lot. And then Neon really, really doing his job, I would say, in the back half of game number 3. As for Heretics, it's a frustrating loss. Remember, I should say that winning or losing this first series does not automatically advance you or automatically eliminate you. There is double elimination at the very worst, so Heretics is certainly not out yet. Vitality, by winning this series moves on to, I guess you could call it winners finals, where they will face the winner of the other series to see who is the first seed promoting into that top 4. Of course, the loser here will play the loser from the other group to have a chance to play the loser of that winners finals in essentially the grand final, little battle for the second seed. You guys know how the format works, but nobody's eliminated here. Heretics, even in their loss, still have a chance to win, but they definitely have shown a few cracks in the armor. I do think that there were some positives to take away for Heretics here, especially in their win in game number 2. And the biggest positive for me in their win was their bot lane, who was actually really good in that game. Jack Spectra and Mursa honestly just outplayed Neon and Kaiser pretty heavily in that game number 2. The Zeri has always been a pretty good pick for Jack. He's been able to do relatively well in the early game at being safe, and he does a very good job of transitioning into the mid game so long as he's not behind. That's been a little bit of an issue for him, is the early 2v2 that he hasn't necessarily been incredibly proficient in, but his transition skills I think are strong. And then honestly, big shout out to Mursa. His Nautilus in game number 2 was phenomenal. Honestly, he was absolutely player of the game, in my opinion, for their win in game number 2. Those hooks that he was landing were spectacular, but they weren't perfect the entire series. Jack had some moments where he looked really good in game number 3, but Mursa was just not very good on the Soraka. He didn't look very practiced on that champion. Ruby had some really good moments on the Syndra in game number 3. It was really Ruby and Jack that were keeping things up for Heretics in that game 3. Unfortunately, they end up falling, and a lot of it is, in fact, due to my dud of the series, unfortunately going to Jankos, who I actually think has been very good for Heretics over the course of the year so far. In my opinion, has easily been this Heretics team best player. He's really pushed them forward, given them the consistency that they need, but he was not good in game number 3. A lot of these engages on the Vi, he was just not making the most of. He was really going in and just immediately dying. This is the problem with Vi when you are playing from a deficit in the jungle, is that a lot of these engages, for as good as Vi can be for immediate lockdown, Vi's not particularly tanky. So if you go in on a, squishy target that has a lot of damage, yes, you're going to be able to knock them up, but once that CC duration is over, they're likely just going to blow you up, and you're not going to actually be able to get a lot off. That's the reason I don't, recommend Vi to worse teams. It's because her kit kind of relies on you being at least remotely ahead in the game, and that's just not what happened here. Evie finally got taken off of Cassante in game 3, and he looked much worse on the Jax than he did on either of the games of Cassante, so that's worth noting. Not that Evie's a bad player, just that I think he's a mid-tier top laner, I should say right now, and going up against someone like Photon, that's just gonna, unfortunately, not be enough. And so, overall for Heretics, not the worst loss in the world. You had moments where you looked good, especially this bot lane, which has been a major question mark for the team, specifically consistency-wise. I really like Mursa as a player. I thought he was really good in game 2, and I thought Jack really stepped up in the series. Ruby had some moments, but the top side, which has ironically been the most consistent part of this team, just could not hold up against an incredibly top side heavy team in Team Vitality. So Heretics is going to have another shot against the loser of Koi and SK, and then obviously whoever, can win that game, they might potentially have another shot to still make it out of this group. But for now, they're going to have to take the long road and the difficult road to get there. As for Vitality, big win here. It puts you one series away from making top 4 in the region, which is honestly the goal for this Vitality team. I would be surprised if they, weren't trying to win a title, especially after just kind of looking like the best team in the regular season. I really wouldn't put it past this team to just kind of cruise their way there, but they did show a few cracks in the armor in this series, most notably some inconsistencies coming out of Perks and Bo, which we've kind of seen in recent weeks. So hopefully they can figure out some, more concrete, cohesive ways to get those two involved, because right now, if you can get everything kind of working and rolling like they did at points in this series, they really are going to be the best team in the LEC. That's going to bring us to our other, Group A first round matchup. I'm not exactly sure what you would call it, but the other matchup to determine who's going to be facing off later in the week to see who gets that number 1 seed. Of course, we had the number 3 seeded SK Gaming taking on the number 7 seeded Koi. Now, Koi is a lower seed than Heretics, but of course, Vitality choosing to play Heretics over choosing to play Koi. I think that was clearly the right decision, as Koi walks into this series against SK and proves that perhaps maybe the best of ones were a tad bit overrated, as they kind of demolished them in this series. Koi looks fantastic. This is a team that has really been struggling in recent weeks. I still think that they are incredibly talented. I said that in my power rankings at the end of last week, but SK had been playing at a really high level. The players, especially the bot lane, had really been playing above expectations. Exakick looked like an MVP level candidate, more so than anybody on Koi, and so I could definitely see SK putting up a fight, even if Koi was the better team here, but that was just not the case. Koi absolutely obliterated them, and really it came down to 2 roles where the gap, I would say, was absolutely massive and really ginormous, and that was the jungle and the mid lane, where really Koi just kind of demolished them. They won both Game 1 and Game 2 in pretty dominating fashion. I think you could give player of the series to either the jungle or the mid on the side of Koi here. For me, I'm going to give it to Malrang, because he was just everywhere. Absolutely everywhere on the map. This game was more like a Malrang show than almost anything else, because he was just everywhere doing everything for this Koi team. This is the Malrang that I have been missing all of the regular split so far. We'll talk a bit about Koi and why I think they're rebounding now in just a little bit, but Malrang getting back to winning early games is definitely an important step in that direction. We always talk about Malrang as a ridiculously feast or famine player, somebody who does so well from ahead and so poorly from behind, and that's really what happened in this series. Is he just won both of the early games, and all of a sudden, the rest of the game was super easy for Koi. They know how to play out of leads incredibly successfully, and really there weren't a lot of ways for SK to be able to come back, because Malrang was just stifling the map, making play after play after play on this Sejuani. It is really difficult to come back even when you are doing well in lanes, which they weren't, which we'll get into. But even if you were doing well in lanes, it's ridiculously difficult to come back into a game where jungle pressure is entirely swung in one direction, and that's what Malrang had over Marcoon in this one. So he's going to get my player of the series. Of course, I don't think he's the only option. I would be remiss not to mention Larson here, who was phenomenal on 2 games of Silas. I've said this all season long, or all split long so far. Larson has easily been the best performing member of Koi in 2023. I don't even think it's particularly close. And the mid gap in this series was ginormous. I know a lot of people have been talking, me included, about how good Certus has been over the course of the regular season so far, how much he has stepped up. But you know what he didn't play in this series? Any of the champions that he was really good at over the course of the regular split. He is a melee assassin merchant, which is fine. There were a lot of really good champions like that. Of course, Akali, Silas, even something like a LeBlanc. Those are the champions that Certus is obviously incredibly well known for, and that he plays at a high level, very similar to a player like Zeka when you look at the LCK, or Closer in the LCK, or Cream in the LPL, that mold of player. He instead plays Jace and Azir in this series, 2 champions that I would consider him to be not nearly as good on, and he showed that in this series. We'll get to SK in a bit, but Larson absolutely styling on him. Larson has legitimately been a fantastic mid laner for this Koi team, even through all of their struggles. He has been the one to step up and really be the consistency for this team, which isn't particularly surprising. Larson is by far the most consistent member of this team in terms of outlook and what he has been able to produce over the past few years. That's kind of what we've always liked about Larson, is that no matter how the team is going, he's always going to give you that consistently solid output, even if he doesn't have like the superstar upside that some of the other mid laners have in the region. But Larson has been a huge positive for Koi over the course of the regular season, and he played like a superstar in this series. So a lot of credit to the jungle mid duo. They were the driving force for Koi, but I have to shout out this bot lane. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Koi's struggles this year, I think, are definitely a little overblown in terms of what the problem is. I know a lot of people are looking at Koi. You hear about this on Euphoria. Like, this was actually something that they brought up, that Koi clearly, downgraded a lot going from Otoamne to Shigenda. And while I agree that it has clearly been a downgrade in terms of both sides, Otoamne got worse going to Excel, Koi got worse with Shigenda coming in. To sit here and say that Shigenda is Koi's problem, I think is naive. I think it's misdiagnosing the problem purely because that is the easiest path to look at in terms of changes. But truthfully, when you watch these games, the biggest reason that Koi was not winning a lot of the games that were super easy for them to win last split was this bot lane. Bot lane was an incredible power point on the map for Koi. Every single game in the regular season, in the playoffs, at Worlds, every game, Comp and Trimby were a huge power point on the map for Koi that they could play through, that they could reliably use as gold income to spread the wealth to the rest of the team, to try and skirmish around the 15-minute mark, to play for dragons, etc., etc. And Comp and Trimby just have not been that over the course of the year so far. To me, I'm not going to say that it was all on one player, to say, like, if they just got better and decided to step up, Koi would automatically be a great team again, but I had been saying throughout all of my weekly recaps, if Comp got back to being one of, if not the best AD carry in Europe, Koi would be a top 1 or 2 team again, instantly. Like, that is really the change that needed to happen. If Comp could get back to winning the lane 2v2, dominating in the early game, and being able to transition that into skirmishes around the mid game, Koi would be fine. That was the problem, is that this bot lane was not winning anymore. And you know what? Comp and Trimby played this series fantastically against what was maybe the best bot lane in the regular split. Comp and Trimby showed up and just looked better in both games, especially game number 2, which was really impressive to watch. And so jungle, mid, ADC support, all looking good. Shigenda playing more tank-oriented passive styles in the top lane. This very much felt like 2022 Koi, 2022 Rogue, I should say, all over again, and that is a fantastic sign for this team. As for SK Gaming, this is not what you wanted to see after a great regular season. You finished 3rd in the regular season. To get kind of blown out in this series is certainly not how you wanted to start your group stage, but it's not over yet. Obviously, you're not eliminated or anything like that. You just have a lot of problems that I think you need to fix. And that, first and foremost, starts in the mid lane. I mean, Certus was completely run off the map in this series. He was a massive problem. He's my dud of the series, and it's not particularly close. He was good in the regular split. I think he had some moments where he looked a little bit better than maybe he was, because I think Marcoon was playing great, and obviously Xkick and DOS were playing at a ridiculously high level, but Certus is still a player that I think has gotten better basically every single split that he's played in the LEC. It's frustrating to see him go into a best of 3. His first best of 3 in the LEC, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong there, and play so bad against a player like Larson. It's definitely disappointing, but again, he can learn, he can grow, hopefully he can get, more comfortable champions as opposed to the Jace, as opposed to the Azir. Don't really love the Amumu pick in game number 2 either. Obviously, we've seen it work in the LCS with Spica and with FlyQuest, but I think generally speaking, it's just kind of weak, especially into something like a Sylas that can just steal the ultimate and make use of that over and over and over again. Marcoon and Certus just kind of got outplayed here. They have to be better in order for this SK team to live up to any sort of the expectations that they had going into this. If they want to make it out and make it into that top 4, which is a pretty lofty goal, but after this regular season seems accomplishable for this team, the jungle mid has to step up. Obviously, the bot lane was slightly worse than the enemy bot lane in this series. I still think Exakick's positioning is incredibly solid, and honestly, this was the first time they ever really lost lane, so I'm willing to give them a little bit of leeway when it comes to that, but DOS was definitely a little bit more exposed, I would say, in this series when it came to laning against players like Comp and Trimby. I still think Xkick was really good, and then Irrelevant, the top lane, was proportionately irrelevant. Top lane, just generally speaking, was not all that important in this series. So overall for SK, their season is not over by any means, or their split is not over by any means. They now have to go in and play a tough team, Heretics team, but a team that, quite frankly, they should be able to beat in a best of 3. That's not going to happen this week. That's going to happen next week. So kind of setting that up, but SK, hopefully they're able to rebound. Hopefully you can get a better performance out of Xkick and DOS, where they're going to be able to carry kind of the SK torch like they did in the regular season. And then hopefully Marcoon and Certus can just be serviceable, unlike what they were in this series. And then for Koi, later in this week, as we're going to talk about next, you now have a date with Destiny with Vitality, and if you can win that, you're automatically in top 4. All that regular season, shebang about not really stepping up, about the bot lane really disappointing, about Maorang not being able to generate leads, about Shigenda not being as consistent in the top lane. It's all null and void if you can just win one more best of 3 and secure yourself into top 4. This really could be one of the best teams in all of Europe, and it could be right now. We're now going to skip ahead a bit because we are going to be finishing off Group A and their week number 1 here in the group stage now, as we see which of the 2 of the winners earlier are going to be the first team to qualify for the top 4 here in the LEC for the actual playoffs. It was a battle between Team Vitality and Koi, and Koi wins 2-0 to lock themselves into the top 4. They finished 7th in the regular season, and then they walk into group stage and they don't drop a single game on their way to qualifying to be a top 4 team in the LEC. Koi has finally gotten right, and it's very fun to watch. Vitality have to be incredibly disappointed to not walk out of this group as the number 1 seed, especially with how they played in the regular season and the talent that is on this team, but Koi has really stepped it up, and honestly, this very much feels like 2022 Rogue all over again. Let's go ahead and talk about what they did really well in this series. And you can't talk about what Koi did well in this series without talking about the bot gap that was on display here for Koi against Vitality. This is what I was talking about in the previous series that Koi had against SK in all of their series in the regular season. If they can get their bot lane on track, if they can get their bot lane together. Trimby had been playing pretty well, especially on things like the Ashe in the mid game and out of the lane 2v2, but if you can get them snowballing early into a position where they're just able to take over the map in terms of the mid game, where Malrang's ahead, where Comp is ahead, and so they feel like they can own the map and make these aggressive plays, then Koi is going to be near unbeatable, and that is exactly what happened here. Comp was able to dominate the laning phase again thanks to Trimby, who I think has been really, really good for Koi over the course of the year, and you'll see Trimby's actually going to be getting my player of the series over Comp. I think, realistically speaking, you could give it to either of them. Both of them were stellar in lane. Their game number 1 was disgusting. You're Zeri Soraka into Sivir Lulu, and you're able to get the push and take the tower at 9 minutes? That is absurd and incredibly well played from Comp and Trimby. They outplayed Neon and Kaiser so much in the lane 2v2 that you just have to give them credit there. But then Trimby just might be the best Ashe support player in the West right now. He is so utterly dominant on that pick that it's almost unfair to give it over. This is something that I feel like at this point you just need to ban against Koi. Lucian Nami and then the Ashe support are just automatic win buttons for this Koi team, which is frustrating because Malrang's got some win buttons. Larson has some win buttons here. He gets his classic Azir in game number 2. There are a lot of things here that Koi really succeeds on in terms of what they're able to use to their advantage, their play style, you know, with their comfort picks. And this is absolutely the case in the bot lane. Comp and Trimby, when they get on these picks that they're incredibly comfortable on, just dominate. And they really, quite frankly, just outclass Neon and Kaiser to a ridiculous extent. Like I said, Trimby's my player of the series. That Soraka game number 1 was disgusting. The amount of pressure that he was able to exert in that laning phase, the support gift that he offered in that game in particular was dominant. But even the Ashe game in game number 2, like I said, those arrows are still incredibly clutch. And his 2v2 lane dominance on that champion, his ability to poke out, even engage supports him, never really put himself in any sort of danger is just, it's incredibly impressive. There really is nothing else to say. He was phenomenal, but you got to give a lot of credit to Comp as well. He played the Zeri so aggressively in game number 1, was able to completely push Sivir off of the wave, and then he picks up the Sivir in game number 2 to be able to just dominate in a lot of these team fights, especially once they start hitting the 10-15 minute mark and Koi starts getting that map advantage. It is actually absurd how well this bot lane played in the series, and they deserve all the credit they are going to get. Credit as well to Malrang. He had a fantastic weekend overall for Koi, and honestly, he looked like one of the best junglers in the league again here. This is what happens when Malrang is able to generate a lead. A player like Bo, you know, we'll talk about it, but he picks something like Nidalee in game number 2, this very aggressive comp in game number 2 that really requires you to skill check in the early game. If Koi is able to generate that lead, that game is just going to be over, and that's exactly what Koi did, and that really plays into this team's hands overall when Malrang is able to generate that lead, especially on something like a Xin Zhao that's able to kind of punch the Nidalee early. It's just dominant. It is strength from start to finish on the side of Koi. They're playing exactly to what they do well, and they really showed it off here. Shigenda, Larson, everybody did their job on the side of Koi, but this was a bot lane masterpiece from Comp and Trimby, and honestly, it's just very impressive, and it's got to be very enlightening and positive for Koi to see that they really are still one of the best teams in Europe, even if they weren't able to show that a lot in Best of Ones. As for Vitality, you've got to at least be a little bit frustrated that you weren't able to get the job done in this series. You were the number 1 team in the regular season for a reason, and to get 2-0'd, that's got to be the frustrating part. Losing to Koi, especially when they're playing as well as they are, like that I think is acceptable. That's something that I think you could swallow pride-wise. Koi was projected to be better than you going into the year. Obviously, they've struggled a bit, but they're clearly gaining form, and it's not particularly awful to lose to them here, but to get kind of blown back by them and 2 games to really never see a moment where they looked like the better team, and to have their flaws exposed so concretely in this series, I do think is a tad bit concerning. I think Bo is really starting to worry me. We'll get to the major problems in a second, but Bo is starting to worry me with how he is able to be exploited by some of the better junglers in the league. Bo relies so much on a lot of these aggressive, 60-40 plays going in his favor because he is going to take them all the time. And when they work, this team looks unbeatable like we saw in the first couple weeks of the season. But he had a really bad week 3 where he was trying to make a lot of these plays and ended up putting his team back a pretty excessive amount. He wasn't perfect in the series against Heretics, certainly in their loss. He wasn't particularly good in that game too. And then he honestly was just completely out-jungled by Malrang in this series. The cracks in Bo's armor are definitely starting to show here. The ego pick of going something like Nidalee in the second game, when I get it, you're really good at Nidalee and you want to pick something comfort-wise, but Nidalee's just really bad in the meta right now, and Malrang pulls out the counter with the Xin Zhao, who's just able to skirmish her super hard early, and if she gets behind, she's ridiculously useless. Perks, for his credit, was pretty good here, but there's only so much you can do to help out Bo. Photon had some moments where he looked solid, especially in game number 2 here on the Olaf, but Bo was losing to Malrang, and like I already said, this bot lane just completely collapsed. Neon and Kaiser, I've talked about how they aren't exactly the strength and the positive point for Vitality. Well, they definitely are the weak point in this series. Dud of the series could go to either of them. For me, it was a pretty easy choice to give it to Kaiser. His laning was just atrocious. His 2v2 laning has not been good overall this year. This is a bot lane that really hasn't been able to generate leads a lot on weak side. They've done a very good job of losing gracefully, I think, against a lot of the other teams, but against Comp and Trimby, a bot lane that's just going to try and push their advantage incredibly hard, we saw what happened. They got abused. They got demolished in that bot lane. So Kaiser's going to get my dud of the series. This is just not the meta for him. He wants to be getting out on the map. He wants to be moving mid lane. He wants to be moving with his jungler. That's what Kaiser has always done at a ridiculously high level, but that's not the meta that we're in. You need to be able to handle yourself in the 2v2 against some of the better bot lanes in the entire region, and Kaiser's just not really capable of doing that right now, and he kind of showed that off here. Neon is not a particularly strong laner either. That is definitely a weakness for this Vitality bot lane. I always talk about how Neon's big strength is not losing in lane and then being really good late game, but when you're going up against Comp and Trimby here, who are incredibly strong in the 2v2 at their best, these two are just going to get exposed and they're going to get abused like they did here. And that's going to be a problem for Vitality. You're going to need that side to be consistently good on weak side so that you can get players like Photon, players like Bo, players like Perks ahead, because you don't really want to be investing resources into Neon. He's not going to give you the same kind of output that this top side would give you if you were to invest a lot into them. And so overall, honestly, Vitality is definitely starting to show some worry. Now, Koi has qualified. They are done with the group stage. They are into the top 4. They will not play another series, but Vitality has not qualified yet, even with their series win earlier. Obviously, next week, we're going to be seeing Heretics take on SK Gaming. The winner of that will then play Vitality, the winner of that going on to the top 4. So Vitality still only has to win one more series against either SK or Heretics, whoever ends up winning that series. Obviously, they should be the favorites in either of those series, but they definitely have shown some cracks. They got demolished by Heretics in that game number 2. All Heretics have to do is shore up a few more things to win an extra game, and all of a sudden they're moving on. And then SK kind of exploits Vitality's weaknesses incredibly well. We saw that in week 2. SK's strength is their bot lane. Vitality's weakness is their bot lane. So some question marks definitely for Vitality moving into the next week. Hopefully they can rebound, get back on the right track. Hopefully their talent can carry them up to where they need to be, because if this team fails to make top 4 after the regular season that they had, that would be absolutely disastrous. But for Koi, congratulations. You were 7th place in the regular season, and you go undefeated in group stage to make the top 4. That's got to be a great feeling for a team that now kind of gets a little bit of a break. Obviously, winning the first couple of games gives you quite the leeway to move into the rest of the split to kind of just watch and prepare and get ready. And that's good for Koi. I think, obviously, this team has definitely found its groove. This bot lane in particular has found its groove. Malrang looks really good. Larson's been good all year. Shigenda's weak side top lane, and that's really, really good. Overall, Koi is looking like the version of Koi we wanted to see going into the year, and that is the best compliment I could possibly give them. They look so much more like the title-winning Rogue team from 2022, and that should leave basically every team in the LEC scared, no matter who you are. Now that we've wrapped up Group A, it's time to move our way over now to Group B. And Group B is certainly an interesting one. Obviously, we know Koi is coming out of Group A Who's going to be matching them coming out of Group B? Well, we kicked it off with the number 2 seed from the regular season taking on the number 8 seed as we saw Mad Lions taking on Astralis. Of course, Astralis very happy to be here. This was a team that was not really projected to be able to make it out of the bottom 2, even through a lot of the weeks of the regular season. Luckily for them, Excel and Fnatic had such glorious disasters of final weeks that Astralis ends up making it out, but unfortunately for them, I think Mad Lions is just a little bit too tough a competition for them to be able to overcome in a best of 3. I think, interestingly enough, though, they were actually definitely able to keep their punches high in this series. They looked pretty good against Mad Lions. They didn't look like they were just going to roll over and die, which is a really good sign from a team that I do think is outskilled at almost every single position. Now, obviously, we can make the argument about, bot lane, which is looking really good for Astralis right now, but Mad Lions in general is just really, really solid. Let's go ahead and talk about them. My player of the series is actually going to go to Chasey. He had such a phenomenal game number 3 on this K'Sante, although, part of it being him, the other part being Astralis just kind of making bad decisions around the K'Sante. Obviously, we can talk about the Astralis draft in game number 3 being incredibly innovative and really interesting, and honestly, on paper, I kind of like this. I think you have opportunities to be able to win a lot of these late game team fights, especially if you're able to get some of these cheese plays to work early. Twitch support can be really interesting. Pairing that with Cassio, AP carry down in the bot lane, a Karma in the mid lane, you have a lot of opportunities here to create kind of numbers advantages for your team, and they really do try and take advantage of that. Obviously, Jonghoon going top lane multiple times pre-level 6 is certainly a choice. I'm not exactly sure why that was the decision. Unfortunately, I think it ended up doing more harm than good on the side of Astralis. It ended up, not really being a problem for K'Sante. He was never really going to die to a Twitch gank, especially before you hit level 3. I think Jonghoon ganked at level 2, and then Finn's wave was honestly kind of screwed over from that point. Chasey just freezes, and he's able to get really, really strong on K'Sante. He's able to kind of take over the mid game, and then eventually we get to that Baron fight, which we will talk about in a bit. But Chasey does a really good job, I think, of playing out the early game, knowing exactly where he needs to be, knowing he needs to not push his advantage because a Twitch could be on the map. He's never really in danger of dying, and then, doing a good job freezing the wave, being able to generate that lead against the Jax in the top lane. And then really what we're talking about Chasey as player of the series for is that game 3 team fight around Baron, where I guess Astralis just, didn't respect the damage. I don't really know what ended up happening here. They either feel like they have to go for Baron or else they lose the game, or they just didn't think K'Sante was going to come in and kill them all, but he comes in, he ults, and they're all dead. Oops, all dead. Chasey ends up basically 1v5ing there with the K'Sante. I mean, obviously, Jonghoon on the Twitch flank isn't exactly the ideal scenario to be in, but that K'Sante ends up taking over so much in that late game team fight. He ends up basically blowing up the entire Astralis team and winning the series for Mad Lions, and that's a really good sign. Chasey's been the weakest link of Mad Lions over the course of the regular season so far. Not that he has been a problem. I don't want it to come across like he has been a problem, because he hasn't for Mad, but I feel like everybody else at some point on this team has won games actively for Mad. Chasey really hasn't been that. He hasn't been a high resource top laner, but Astralis investing a lot of resources into him ends up getting him really fed, and then obviously not respecting his damage ends up being a big turnaround for Chasey and for Mad, and helps them win this series. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for Mad. They certainly had some moments where they didn't look particularly great. As good as I think Niski and Elyoya were in this series, Carzzy and Hylissang maybe not as much. We started to see some cracks in the armor of this very volatile bot lane. As good as Carzzy and Hylissang have been when they are on and when they're winning lane and able to play from ahead, they still do show a lot of problems playing from behind. We saw that I believe it was the Vitality game where they ended up just not looking particularly good towards the back half. That's the one where Hilly just flashes in on the Lulu and polymorphs and nobody dies. That could be Fnatic, it could be Vitality. You guys will let me know down in the comment section below. But there have been times where they have lost early on and aren't really able to recuperate, and unfortunately, that was kind of the case in a lot of these games here. Game 2 in particular, Kobbe and Jonghoon are notoriously very strong, especially compared to the rest of Astralis, and so they were actually able to get a pretty sizable lead on Carzzy and Hylissang, and I would argue that Kobbe and Jonghoon were better in this series overall. Obviously, Game 3, definitely a little bit of a different story. Cassio's basically playing weak side against Aphelios Thresh because he's 1v2ing for a lot of laning phase. Jonghoon just out on the map trying to make, these crazy, almost cheese-oriented plays. Sometimes it's going to work, sometimes it's not, but Kobbe not really given a lot of direction here, and so Game 3 is a lot more difficult. But Game 2, when they're playing this Lucian Nami, they were actually able to generate a pretty sizable lead into a Draven Ashley that should be kind of dangerous to play into. So overall, Carzzy and Hylissang definitely not perfect this series, but Chasey looking good. I thought Niski continued to look really, really good. He was the best mid laner in the regular season, in my opinion. He has continued to just over-exceed any expectations that I've had of him. Elyoya plays his role as kind of the facilitator for this Mad Lions team perfectly, and overall, I just think that topside looked really good for Mad, and if their bot lane can kind of come together, then they are going to be a force to be reckoned with in this group against anybody. As for Astralis, Unfortunate they weren't able to pick up the win here. I do think that this team genuinely competed their hearts out and tried their best. Obviously, their split's not over yet. Losing this does not mean you're eliminated. It's double elimination, so you're still alive here, but it's definitely going to take a little bit of recuperating in order to get there. My dud of the series is going to go to 113, although I don't even think 113 played particularly awful here. He was on engagers on a team that was behind in gold. Sometimes you're just going to make some bad plays, but I really don't think anybody on Astralis really stood out as being poor. I actually think the biggest standouts in this game in terms of like losing lane and losing pressure were Karzi and Hylissang on the side of Mad Lions, but I do think that they looked really good in that game number 1 on the Lucian Nami, so it was hard for me to give them dud of the series. I don't think 113 really had any sort of spectacular plays, so he ends up getting it. I think obviously the call to go for Baron, I'm not going to put that entirely on the jungler, but him not being able to recognize that that is an awful idea is problematic, and him not really making any sort of positive plays on the side of Astralis, him getting out jungled quite frankly by Elyoya, especially in their losses. It definitely shone through, but again, I don't think Astralis really played all that bad. I don't think there was anybody that I could really point to on the team and say, like, they were awful. I think Dior definitely stands out for game number 1, where he was bad, and honestly, his Karma game number 3 was incredibly irrelevant. He really wasn't able to do anything, but he dominated in game number 2 on that Sylas, and so it's very difficult for me to give him dud of the series. Finn didn't look particularly good in game number 3, but honestly, he kind of got his wave and his lane completely trolled by his support in Jonghoon, who just came up and basically got his wave frozen under tower, and he really wasn't able to do anything from that point onwards. Of course, Kabe had to play 1v3 in the bot lane, and I actually thought he was really good in the other games, and so it was very difficult for me to pick someone on Astralis that deserved it. Unfortunately, it's just going to go to 113. I think overall for this Astralis team, you held your own. This was probably the best case scenario for a team like Astralis. I don't think you were ever realistically thinking about beating Mad Lions. That would have been a massive upset, the biggest upset that probably could happen here in the first round of the group stage, but, you definitely held your own. Game 2 was a nice win. Game number 3 was definitely possible to win, although you made some crucial mistakes down the stretch. I think Kabe and Jonghoon continue to look like an incredibly solid bot lane, one that can genuinely keep up with a lot of the other teams in the LEC, and, Dior on a good day can compete. I think, obviously, the inconsistency is shining through, and I still think he's probably the weakest mid laner in the LEC, but he can compete. Finn's okay, 113's okay. I do think you have ways to win games on this team, and I certainly don't think that it is impossible to imagine a world in which they can win, a best of 3 here as we move on in loser's bracket, but for now, Astralis definitely still looking like the team we thought they were going to be going into the group stage. As for Mad Lions, you're going to feel lucky to be able to walk out of this. Your top side played really well. Hopefully that's going to be able to keep up. You're just hoping that you can get a better performance out of Karzi and Hylissang, perhaps a more consistent performance out of those two, because when those two perform, Niski and Elyoya have been so ridiculously consistent over the beginning part of the season. Chasey's good with resources and without resources. I think Mad is legitimately a contender to win the LEC this split, and it's all really going to be about what version of this bot lane you are getting. Unfortunately, in this series, it wasn't all that good, but fortunately for Mad, they are still talented enough to be able to pull it out. Hopefully, we see a better version of this team overall as we move into winners finals. Moving on to our other best of 3 here in round 1 here of Group B, the series that I was most looking forward to, at least in these round 1 matchups, we had G2 Esports taking on Team BDS. And the series did live up to expectations through the first 2 games. Unfortunately, Game 3, a little bit of a slaughter as G2 is able to get the job done and take down a very feisty BDS team. Now, looking at the drafts for this series, you can really see why BDS was able to stay in it for as long as they did. In fact, both teams going to Comfort here. Yike going to Lilia and Bel'Veth a lot over the course of this series. Hans playing Kai'Sa and Xayah and, not really prioritizing Lucian Nami or Zeri Lulu or even Caitlyn really in any of these games. Really wanting to go to more comfort. And you could say the same thing about BDS there on the other side. Adam with Garen in game number 1. Shout out Moosehater. Hope he's doing well. Olaf obviously in game 2. We'll talk about the R5 Renekton in game 3 once we get there. But overall, I would say both teams definitely pulling out the stops to try and win this series when it came to comfort. Unfortunately, G2 just did it slightly better. I think that there were a lot of candidates for player of the series on the side of G2, who I think just generally played really well as a unit in this series. But for me, I'm going to give it to Hans Sama, who just continues to be incredibly positive here as G2's bot laner. He's having a much better season than anything he had in 2022 there for Team Liquid. Coming back, getting to play with Mickey, getting to play with Caps, even getting to play with Yike, who I think has really improved him a lot. I think it's just generally been such a positive for Hans in his career development, and he's really shown it. He's not only good on the Draven. I know he's had a couple of bad games over the course of the regular season so far. I think a lot of AD carries have had some up and down moments, mostly because the AD carry pool in EU right now is just so strong. It's improved so much over the course of this split in general that you know, it's pretty hard to be consistently great, even going into someone like Crownie. Crownie's had a fantastic split. He is definitely in the All-Pro conversation so far for 2023, but Hans really looked fantastic on the Kai'Sa, on the Xayah, on the Varus, all of them. Even on the Xayah game, too, that he wasn't, you know, winning on, he still looked okay. He was positioning well on it. It's just, you know, you weren't able to make a lot of plays with Xayah Nautilus, unfortunately, in that one, but he was just really, really solid on these champions that I think most people would consider not super OP right now, especially going into something like the Zeri and the Caitlyn, and so big props to Hans. I think he has been really, really good. One of the best AD carries in all of Europe. Certainly one of the most consistent. Big credit to Mickey as well. 3 games of engagers. What is it? 2021? Like, where are we? I really love to see this. Obviously, engagers are a lot of fun to watch at a pro level. Certainly more fun than the enchanters, even if I don't think that they are quite optimal right now. But Mickey plays them at such a high level. Obviously, he's such a good engager player. That's really what we know him for. He's much more gauge-oriented and roam-oriented than he is kind of focused on the 2v2. We'll get to roams in this series when we start talking about BDS, especially in game number 3, but Mickey played his job really well. His Leona in game 3 in particular was a lot of fun to watch. I also want to give a big shout out to Yike. Yike, I think, got the broadcast player of the series here. I do think he absolutely deserves it. Obviously, Lilia and Belveth being able to pull those out, and honestly, just having more pressure than Sheo does on picks like Sejuani and Elise is very impressive in the current meta that we're in. Yike is probably the best jungler in Europe right now, and I think that's a very impressive statement to get to say for a rookie and someone who has been, I guess, surrounded with such carry-oriented talent. For him to be able to step up and really be able to perform at a level where he can look like a star in this G2 team, I think it's commendable. It's impressive to be able to play around his champions and the style that he likes to go for. It's just good stuff. It's good shit coming out from G2. Jungle and bot looked really solid in the series. I want to give a big shout out to Caps. I know some people are going to make fun of Caps because his game 3 on the JC was missing shock blasts left and right. I mean, just sometimes it happens, right? But his macro awareness and his ability to change the fate of the game, just generally speaking, is incredibly high. You're looking at a Caitlyn Karma bot lane for BDS. That needs to be pushed up. That needs to be playing aggressive. He played in Fog incredibly well in game number 3. Obviously, that roam bot lane really changed the complexity of the game from that point onwards. It gave Hans and Mickey a ton of space to work with when it came to playing that Varus Leona in terms of the aggression that they ended up wanting to go for, and that roam really did it all. Credit to Caps for that. He knows exactly where he needs to be on the map at basically any given time. Caps was actually in my running for player of the series here. It's just, you know, sometimes the micro of what he's able to do, the mechanics weren't exactly there in this series, but still an incredibly strong series from him. And then Broken Blade in the top lane was just better than Adam in that third game by a considerable amount. We'll talk about Adam's Renekton in that third game once we get to it, but Broken Blade really dominating there. Everybody on G2, it's just looking like a well-oiled machine. They look fantastic as a unit, as a group, and that's basically the best thing you could possibly say about G2 moving into the, you know, upcoming games here. And then for BDS, it's unfortunate you weren't able to take this. I actually think you were in a position after game 2 where you were feeling confident. You were definitely in a position where you could win, and then Game 3 just kind of fell to pieces. It was a complete and utter demolition on the side of G2, and a lot of that has to do with just the players not being able to step up. Really, you know, the players that have carried you up until this point for BDS, your superstars have been your top and your bot lane. Adam and then Crownie and Labrov have been fantastic for you. All 3 of them were really shit in game number 3. There really is no other way to put it. Adam goes like 0-7 on the R5 Renekton. There's no way to deflate an analyst more than seeing R5 Renekton after Adam has pulled out the Garen and the Olaf in the first 2 games, especially going into Jax. It did not work out. He got utterly destroyed on that pick. He was the worst player in game number 3, but my dud of the series is actually going to go to Labrov in the support position. He was really outplayed a lot in this series. Even on the Alistar engages in game number 1, it didn't feel like any of them were really all that impactful. He was okay on the Lulu in game 2, but the Karma is really what he gets this for in game number 3. Even if Adam was slightly worse up on the top side, Adam actually had some really good games in games 1 and 2. I don't think Labrov really had those, and Labrov's game 3 was not good. Not only do you really need to pressure early on Karma and Caitlyn in order to be able to generate the lead that you need to in order to scale into the mid game where Caitlyn really does struggle, but Labrov didn't even want to do that. He didn't even try to play the 2v2. Like, I can't stress this enough. He didn't even try to play the 2v2. Instead, he started roaming. You know, they died early to a nice Caps gank, and so Labrov said, well, bot's doomed. I'm going to leave. I'm going to try to get nuke ahead. I'm going to try to play with Sheo. And I talk about how Karma is kind of an underrated roamer, especially in the meta right now where people don't really seem to want to roam, but this is not the scenario to roam. You are literally dooming Crownie if you roam, and that's exactly what happened. Hans was able to kind of get out of control in that bot lane. The Leona exerted so much pressure, and the Caitlyn was just lost from that point. A Caitlyn who notoriously already has a very weak mid-game was made even weaker, obviously, by the introduction of the fact that she had no gold, and so Crownie was really no impact on the game, and then you're looking at the rest of the team. Who's going to win these team fights? The Ryze, the Sedge, the 0-7 Renekton? Like, where exactly are you going to be able to generate your damage from to be able to try and steal any sort of objective or to kind of win a skirmish in the jungle? Like, where is it coming from? BDS just kind of lost early, and once the Caitlyn got behind, they were doomed in that game number 3. And in my opinion, that was Lebrov's bad decision-making that got us there. Hopefully they're able to bounce back. I think Crownie and Lebrov have been one of the biggest surprises positively in the LEC so far this split, and I would really like to see them be able to continue to prove that. Obviously, this team now has a date with Destiny set up with Astralis, a team where they absolutely should be. They absolutely should be able to be better than Astralis. Astralis has a strength in the bot lane. I would argue that BDS is better, or at least it has been over the course of the season. Adam should be able to be better than Finn, and, you know, you're looking at, you know, mid lane potentially being a weakness for BDS. Well, it's potentially an even bigger weakness for Astralis. They just match up really well against that Astralis team. Hopefully next week, we're going to be able to see BDS bounce back nicely, even though they weren't really able to take care of business here. But for G2, they've got a series coming up in just a second that we're going to talk about against that Mad Lions team. It's going to be a very fun one. These two teams always play each other really tough. G2's bot lane's playing at a really high level. They maybe have the best jungler in the league. Elyoya is certainly going to give him a run for the money. And Caps versus Niski is always a blast. Really, I'm excited to see how that matchup goes, and I don't want to waste too much time, so let's go ahead and get into it. And get into it we shall, as we are now going to go over the winners finals here in Group B. Which of these teams in the second group is going to punch their ticket to the top 4 here in the LEC as the number 1 seed in their group? Well, the winner between Mad and G2 was G2 Esports in 2 games, 2-0. Easy peasy, no questions. They look fantastic. They continue to dominate, and G2 has now punched their ticket to the top 2. Koi and G2 as the top 2 teams right now. What is this? 2022 all over again. Looks like regular season really didn't matter, as both Mad and Vitality can't quite get it done as the number 1 seeds in their group. But G2 looking phenomenal here. Let's go ahead and talk about the series. Player of the series is simple. It's Draven. It's Draven all the way. Hansama gets 2 games of Draven here, his best champion. I'm not exactly sure how you give this over to him, not once, but twice in the series. I feel like that is unacceptable, and Hans makes you pay for it. Not only is he able to generate a really strong lead in game number 1, but he's able to stop a really strong lead from Mad in game number 2, where they were actually in a pretty decent position. Not a great one, but, you know, they had a champion on their team that they could play through in Niski Silas, who did a really good job of dominating early, taking advantage of the Cassid and weak point. And unfortunately, Niski giveth, Niski taketh away. He ends up accidentally Eing into the Soraka in the back. He ends up getting silenced under tower and giving over a 1k gold shutdown to the Draven. And then, oops, game over. Oops, game over now. And you gotta give a lot of credit to Hansama, obviously, for being able to capitalize on it. It's an unfortunate circumstance to have happen to Mad Lions, but Hans capitalized. He did the damage he needed to, and he came away from this week looking like an absolute beast. One of the best AD carries in the entire region. Another really, really good series from him. Him and Mickey just have really good team fight chemistry together. That's really what I'm starting to learn, is obviously, I think their 2v2 is a little bit, it's good. It's just, there are other 2v2s in the league that I think are like unstoppable when they play right. I don't think Hans and Mickey are necessarily on that level in terms of like the pre 5 to 7 minutes of the game. But what they do is just dominate. I mean, 15 to 25 minutes. The mid game for Hans and Mickey is just better than almost anybody in the entire league, and that's definitely shown here. They have a very innate understanding of where both of them need to be in these fights and how they both play off of each other incredibly well. So credit to G2. They've really learned how to unlock these two, kind of get both of them back into form in 2023 after, like I said, a lot of times at the beginning of the year, both of them had quite tragic 2022s. It's really, really fun, really impressive to see both of these two players playing incredibly well. Big credit to Yike. He played well again here. Pulls out the Lilia, his signature pick, as I'm going to call it here in the LEC at this moment. Then something a little bit more standard with the Maokai in game 2. Looked really good on both. Caps certainly had some ups and downs, was really good in game number 1 on the Tristana, was definitely a little bit outclassed at the beginning of game number 2. You're playing the Cassid, and Niski took advantage of that, trying to get an advantage early, and he did so. Niski got super far ahead, but fortunately Niski throws away his lead. Caps does a really good job of being able to rebound and deal some damage on Cassid, and once we hit that mid-game, really impressive stuff from him. And then Broken Blade, I mean, just running into fights. I mean, he's walking at them menacingly. That's just what he does. No fear coming out on Broken Blade, especially in these team fights. I said this earlier, I'm going to say it again here. G2 is just such a well-oiled machine as a group. They play together so effectively and so strongly that they are almost more than the sum of their parts, and their parts are already fantastic. You're looking at some of the best players in the entire region, all of them within their roles, and somehow this team feels even stronger as a unit than they do individually, and that's just a testament to how well G2 is playing at the moment. They absolutely deserve to get in here as the number 1 seed out of Group B, and I honestly can't say I'm surprised. This is what I predicted going into this week. As for Mad Lions, though, it's unfortunate you weren't able to take a game here. You had your moments in game 2. Game number 1, not necessarily so much. It was a little tough to pick dud of the series here because I don't really think anybody played particularly bad. Obviously, Nisqy made some game-losing plays for Mad Lions, but they wouldn't have been in those games in the first place without Nisqy, and so I have a hard time giving him dud of the game here. It is eventually going to go to Elyoya here on Mad Lions. He just never had pressure in this series, and I think losing pressure really made it a lot more difficult for Mad to actually play out a lot of these mid-games. G2 had such strong control, especially over bot side of the map and over Dragons, and even Heralds. Like, objective control was just so in favor of G2 that Mad had a very difficult time actually gaining gold back in a lot of these deficits. You know, you could flame like Hylissang for not particularly having great laning phases, Carzzy for not having particularly great laning phases, but I think Elyoya early on in games not being able to generate leads against Yike, especially in that game number 1 against the Lilia, that's where he really looked the worst. I think that was just a little bit frustrating. This is a situation where Elyoya needs to prove that he is the best jungler in the league, like we all thought he was going to be going into the year. He certainly was valued as such by a lot of the other organizations in the LEC, teams like G2, teams like Fnatic, basically begging Mad Lions to sell them. He goes into the series against Yike and just doesn't perform up to standards. He's going to need to be better. Nisqy was fantastic at the beginning of game 2, obviously. Some unfortunate moments to kind of lose them the series, but he also had some great ones, that quick thinking to be able to steal Soraka ult to keep himself alive for a little bit longer and peel out. It's just you know, an unfortunate misplay that ends up costing him the series. Carzzy and Hylissang, another series where they were not the better bot lane. It is a little bit concerning to see them go up against some good bot lanes here and not really be able to perform. What it really shows me is that they are going to be able to take care of maybe some of the worst bot lanes in the league, some of the ones that aren't clicking at the same level as, you know, they are, and, you know, Kabe and Jonghoon were, or Hansam and Mickey are, but they're maybe not going to be one of the best bot lanes. They're just going to be volatile and inconsistent, which is what we thought they were going to be going into the year. And then Chasey's he's someone who's going to look good on a good team and not look good on a bad team, you know, if the team's playing bad. So it's just how it is for Mad Lions. Obviously, they're not eliminated. They still have a pretty good chance to get out of this group. We're going to see who's going to be winning between BDS and Astralis. Mad Lions will be taking on the winner of that series next week. They should beat both. It really shouldn't even be all that close. I would love to see Mad Lions versus BDS. I think that is a very interesting matchup. But Mad Lions looked so good in the regular season. They were able to take care of business there. I would hope that they would be able to do the same against whoever they faced to make their way into the top 4. But for G2, you're going to feel comfortable that you locked this. It really wasn't all that in doubt, I would say. They were definitely the favorites to come out of this group. I think a lot of people saw them as a better team than Mad Lions, even if Mad finished better than them in the regular season, and they definitely proved that. I think really the big takeaway is how freaking good this bot lane is when they are able to generate leads, when they are able to play strong side. Hansama was probably the best player in the league this week, and that's very impressive to say. You know, Yike had a great week. I think Caps played really well macro-wise. Mickey's looking good. Broken Blade's looking good. The entire team is just clicking right now. There is a very real world in which G2 is just simply the best team in the LEC right now, and, you know, that's how you know nature is healing. G2 at the top of the standings. Alright, that is going to do it for my LEC Winter Split Group Stage Round 1 overview and analysis. A very, very fun week. Of course, we've got some exciting games next week as well. We've got the losers finals in both groups, as well as the final entrance into the playoff stage, basically the knockout stage of the LEC here in the Winter Split to crown our champion. We're already getting close to wrapping up Winter Split with how fast things move in the LEC. If you guys did enjoy the video, let me know down in the comments section below. What do you guys think is going to happen next week? What do you think not only of Koi and G2 being able to make it out, but who do you think is going to be joining them? Any potential upsets or surprises you guys want to call? I'd love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback down in the comment section below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. It really does mean a lot for the channel. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content. Of course, if you're new here, not only do I do LEC weekly recaps, I should say, I also do the same for the LCS, the LPL, the LCK, and the NACL. So if you're interested in that, hit the subscribe button. Obviously, it'll get all of those videos right into your recommended feed, so you can get a nice recap of all of the LoL Esports action that's happening all over the world right now. But that's going to do it. So with that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.